Hey, welcome back, everyone. We're talking about agricultural outlook as well as sort of the economics of the situation. So why don't we first start with some introductions to uh, have you all introduce yourself, and then we'll get into some questions and answers.
Okay. Hi, I'm Malika Bordigioni. I'm a research manager with the University Center for Economic Development at UNR, and I work with the FAPRI program as well.
And I'm Mike Helmar. I'm also a research manager with the University Center for Economic Development and the Agricultural Experiment Station at UNR. And I work with Malika on the FAPRI program projections.
And I'm Tom Harris. I'm a professor in economics, but I'm also with Nevada Ag Experiment Station and Cooperative Extension. And also I head up, I'm director of the University Center for Economic Development. We kind of specialize in ag and rural economic development issues.
And I'm Bob Conrad. I am here to help ask some questions that hopefully we have answers to. And we're in a very unprecedented situation, you know, on a world level. So I guess to be more specific, Malika, do you want to start and talk about some of what you're seeing as far as supply chain? That's a big issue right now.
Yeah, so over the course of the last couple of weeks, if anyone is tuned into our previous chats, we've been talking about the various impacts to the ag sector from the COVID virus. One of the things that we've touched on in the past is transportation, but now we're really getting some better information about the entire supply chain. So when we say supply chain, we're talking about, you know, from the producer level through trucking, transport, production, distribution to wholesalers and retailers. Wholesalers would be going more towards institutional and commercial. Retailers are going to go towards grocery stores and that sort of thing to the consumer. So what's interesting about this time is that we're not really having, even though folks might notice that when they go to the grocery store that they might not have the chicken they're looking for, or ground beef, or toilet paper, other products like that. We're not really having a shortage. We don't really necessarily have a shortage of what's being produced, and we don't have a shortage of demand. So our supply and demand that's not where we're having the problems. It's really the middle part, that supply chain. And there's a couple ways that it's really been disrupted during these COVID impacts. We see the major impact is the shift from wholesale to retail demand. So as I mentioned, wholesale is going to be the commercial, institutional demand. And a lot of producers, or a lot of production and manufacturing is set up to package for one stream of demand or the other. So when you think about what is delivered to a commercial or institutional, to restaurants or that sort of thing, you're going to have much larger bulk packaging and bulk quantities. These production facilities, these manufacturing facilities can't easily switch over from, say, delivering a 20-pound bag of shredded cheese to the 16-ounce that we would buy as a consumer in the retail store. And then, of course, that inability to make those shifts, we see that trickle down through the system as well. The other thing that's impacting the supply chain is the shortage of labor, both due to stay-at-home mandates or stay-at-home regulations, and people getting sick. Just this week, we've heard of a corn processing plant, a beef processing plant, and a pork plant, all that were closed because there were a number of employees who had contracted COVID, and they shut down the facility in order to try and control the virus. We're also seeing, in terms of labor, is that with agriculture in particular, there's a lot of H-2A or migrant labor that has to be approved for temporary foreign workers. That's about 20% of all agricultural labor. Because of the stay-at-home, the folks that process those permits are also staying at home, so you have a decrease in the labor processing there, and then the labor itself is just not as able to allocate across state lines, or sometimes even country lines in order to get here to work. That labor's also impacted our shipping and transportation. So you're seeing less cargo ships, and ships that are reaching their destination are having to idle for a longer time. This is adding on to the costs. You think of when a taxi shows up to your house, the meter keeps running. The same is true with those cargo ships. There's fees associated with them sitting in port if there's not enough labor to offload those ships. The lack of cargo ships running has also decreased the number of refrigerated containers for things such as dairy and meats that need to be refrigerated. And so we're just really seeing how the lack of labor in the field due to the COVID is really impacting the availability. And then this is resulting in also, there's one other aspect too, is that some countries for staples such as rice and wheat are actually curbing exports. So while we do grow a decent amount of rice here in the US, Thailand is the main world exporter for rice. And while they're still exporting, other countries, such as Vietnam, are deciding to limit their number of exports to make sure they have enough demand there. In terms of that type of international trade, in terms of demand for US products, the dollar is very strong right now against a lot of other international currencies, and that actually makes our exports a little less competitive. We may see the dollar weaken a bit as this crisis subsides, and also because of the extent of debt that's being accumulated with the government relief packages. So yeah, to sum that up, the supply chain, the main disruption, I believe, is the shift from wholesale to retail, and the manufacturing plants' inability to switch over the packaging easier, and then the labor and transport delays. Transport delays are really just a function of labor delays as well. We just don't have enough workers out there.
Thank you, Malika.
Mm-hmm.
Mike, would you like to weigh in on consumer confidence? What are you seeing right now? What are the trends? What's happening?
Well, it was surprising as I looked at the Consumer Confidence Index, the one that was just released at the end of March. I was surprised at just how well it had held up. I mean, it is down some, but it came in at 120. That might not mean anything to most folks, but a Consumer Confidence Index above 100 implies some confidence that consumers have. And below 100, they're losing confidence. I think right now the last numbers that were released were that it was at 120. Now the expectations had been for it to be at 110, and so that was surprising that it was at 120. But even at 120 is a 3-year low for consumer confidence. So consumers are beginning to lose confidence. Another feature of this confidence is it's not a daily thing that you can measure. So what we're seeing is stuff that probably really reflects early to the middle of March. I suspect with things that have, as things have been shaking out, that consumer confidence today would be considerably lower than that. That's just my guess. But it has held up surprisingly well. Now, part of that would help buoy that would be the $2 trillion package that people are supposed to get payments. At the time that these numbers were really put together, the expectations were that payments were really imminent. Now we're seeing some folks getting some delays in that, depending on how, whether they've filed for taxes or whether they have direct deposit and things of that nature. I suspect with that delay in those payments that we're seeing in some areas, that the confidence from those folks would be considerably lower. Another piece of that that's not on the consumer side, but more on the producer side, is if we look at the Institute for Supply Management, they put out a survey of manufacturing managers and their take on things. And that one is I think, a little more telling. It's a little more pessimistic. that one is showing that their confidence or their expectations are for contractions. That they're not as confident as the consumers might be, so they're for contractions. But it varies by industry to industry. If we look at where the most pessimism is in with the manufacturing side of things, and these also include some transportation ones, is in the I'm having a senior moment, just like Tom did. Durable goods manufacturing. Those big ticket items that not only are things like cars and things like that, but also for things for the other industries like machinery, automobiles, trucking, things of that nature. Those things are really taking a downturn on the production side. The ones that have held up, though, are the consumer non-durable goods. Those are the things like what we're seeing fly off the shelf. Those are food. Those are paper products, things of that nature. So they're holding up a little bit more because the demand is still there, and we kind of need to manufacture those on a daily to a weekly basis. And we're kind of seeing some of those things. We'll talk about ag prices in a little bit, but we're seeing some of that kind of thing play out in some of the ag markets, particularly the milk market is showing some of that stress as well.
Okay. Yeah.
Having said that, there are a few things, and this is a little tongue in cheek, but there are several areas that are kind of being touted by the news. You see them as holding up very well. We've had firearms and ammunition sales are way up, probably mostly my neighbors. And we've had, the last thing that I heard is that alcohol consumption and sales were up by 70% in this country. That's kind of a rough mix. So I hope that the worst fears don't get played out. On the other side, we found out that Bibles are flying off the shelf. So, take that for what it is. We've got doomsdayers versus folks that are confident in the Lord. So, people's perceptions of things that are going on and their confidence is not even across the board.
Right. Tom, kicking it over to you. What are you seeing? Or, historically, we just came out of a recession in the last few years. Are we in another one? Are we headed into one? And if so, how do we move out of that?
Okay, yes. Just to reiterate what Mike said, one time I was in a county and they had a gun show with free beer. That was an accident looking for a place to happen, I think. But what happened with this recession, there's three outcomes people are looking at. One's called a V. V, you go down and you go right back up the same rapidly. There's a U, you go down and you chug along for a little while and then you go up. And the one we really don't want is an L. I think this is Japan. Goes down and stays very low for a long time. The V is something we like to see, but I think it won't happen. And it is contingent. Like all this is contingent on if and when we get the vaccine for this COVID-19. If it'll allow us to go and meet with people, almost go back to status quo. The other one, would be if maybe something well, I say like a U, is that we're getting close to a vaccine, but maybe there's some mitigation serums that we can take, something like Theraflu or something that can mitigate it somehow. Or we're still stuck. The only thing that works is staying inside. A lot of people are thinking of the U kind of thing. And I know I was watching CNBC, Jim Cramer guy that does a lot of stock markets. And also the CNBC had a lot of investors. The main thing they're worried about is basically this. One guy was saying, I'm not going to go back. Number one, I'm not going to get on a plane and fly. People are worried because the worrying is basically built on uncertainty. We have this virus. We're just learning as we're going. it looks like it's some minorities are having more impacts than the others, and they're trying to find out why. I remember the Fauci was talking about there's people there. If you look at them, same built, same, just like the same, but one person can fight it, and the other one can't. What's doing that? And so much uncertainty. How long is it going to last? How, you know, 3 feet apart, 7, you know, I think something came out like 10 feet apart we need to be around. Does it last a long time on your surfaces? There's a lot of things that people are uncertain. If you think that one guy was saying he likes to go to Vegas and the casinos, he said, I'm not going to sit real close to a bunch of people with uncertainty how this thing transmits. That's going to be something that's going to hurt us here. And I think also for agriculture, I think Mike has talked about this before, about the cuts of meat. Going to a buffet is going to be, is it an act of bravery, or, you know, you're going to be spread out, how close, or you're going to be in, you know, like the Wisconsin, everybody going to be under plexiglass and all this kind of stuff. That will slow the recovery in many different types of economic sectors. And, you know, Nevada being gaming, that's one of them. I think Mike and Malika brought up a lot of things, is that the V almost means instant return. Well, it's not going to be instant return. We have, number one, the guy was talking about, once you got your people and you're going to work, who's going to be the first to go in? And you have a meeting room like we have of your executives, who's going to be the first to go in? And it's a lot of worrisome about that. Then the supply chain. We've had, I know I was talking to a friend of mine at Texas A&M, and Mike has talked about this. Lamb prices have really dropped because the demand for lamb is mostly on the East Coast. That's shut down a lot because people are not going out to eat, they're staying. But that has, in fact, what I understand, Mike, is that the pelts, you know, usually you got some money for the wool. No, you got to pay for that because it's selling at negative. And so it's causing a lot of problems that way. They've talked about, you know, oil, they talked about milk, what Malika did. It's not piping through. Again, if it comes up, how does it get started? And there's a lot of initial inertia that you have to go to get people going back to work. There's a lot of, to get even the whole operation of this chain, transportation, the manufacturing, get it up and going. You may have to do different cuts. And the psychology, I think, of the people. She's talking about alcohol sales. Well, people maybe the first 2 weeks were handling it, and maybe it's getting tough on some folks. And a lot of things can happen on that. So getting back to the quote unquote normal is contingent on, I think, this coronavirus, because it's full of uncertainty. If we had risk means we can take probabilities, and Mike has done it and Malika have done on prices. You take the data and here's what will happen. We kind of within 95% interval. In 2008, a lot of the monetary people, when we started getting approached to zero interest rates, we never seen that. And they're saying, well, we're making predictions outside our data set. And they were kind of uncertain what will happen. Here, the corona with the scientists, you talk to different scientists, well, this drug will work, this won't, well, it will work, and all this. If you have no certainty on that, people are scared. And I think in 2008, we didn't have social media. Now you have social media, and people are aware of this stuff much, 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 much more. And arresting that first will get us as close to normal as we were. Now, even if we come out of normal, there's going to be people who are going to have job skills that people have started working off. There's going to be jobs that are going to be not there anymore because we do business different. That's going to happen. And there may be new jobs for people who can work with computers at home. That's going to be different. So coming out of it, I don't think the V. It's going to be like a U. It'll get started. If we haven't had a virus or some Theraflu, we'll all be scared. Oh, we'll fall. All of a sudden, everything starts in the fall again, and you'll hear people getting very worried. So I think of a U-term, and I hope the biochemists can get some kind of medicine to harness this thing, at least give us boundaries so we can be more confident of what the impacts might be.
Well, hopefully it's a narrow U, not a big.
Not like in Miami U, yes. It's unfortunately, it's all dependent on science, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Mike, do you want to talk a bit about, what's happening in the markets right now in terms of the crops and livestock?
Yeah. We talked last week that things weren't really good. I think I'm going to give one word that kind of describes the overall tone of things for agricultural prices right now, and that's dismal. What we've seen in the last week are some, I'm going to call crashes in some of those prices. Again, they had gone down for a while. The beef prices had gone down for a while. Wool prices had gone down, and they had kind of leveled off a little bit last week. And I was kind of scratching my head and wondering what was causing that, or if they would persist. Well, the answer to that is no, they did not persist. We look at the beef prices, the beef cattle prices. I don't mean beef prices at the retail level. Those are going up because of constraints on the supply side, in the stores. But I'm talking about like feeder steer prices, slaughter steer prices. Those things dropped again a bunch in this last week, and they did it across practically every state. In fact, across all states that produce cattle, and they dropped about another $10 or so per hundredweight this week. Now, yesterday, beef and milk prices ticked up. I think that may be just kind of noise in the marketplace a little bit, or in the prices. I don't know. I can't think of any reason why it would be sustained. It would be great if it was, but they are very low again. And part of the reason, before I talk about milk and wool and lamb again, I'm going to talk about a little bit about the point that Malika made and Tom reiterated, and that's the supply side, the supply chain. Malika is absolutely correct that the supply chain is the problem. The demand is still there, particularly if people can get their payments. They will still buy things, and for some products are still in a hoarding mode. Again, you go and you see the paper products off the shelves. Well, one of the bellwethers for me is going to be when I can go to the grocery store after noon and see paper products on the shelves. Right now they're completely gone. But so the demand is still there on that side. The ag producers, that supply is still there. They haven't liquidated herds. They are dumping milk, which we'll talk about a little bit because there's no place for them. But it's that processing in the middle and then the transportation after that. The processing is, as Malika said, some plants are closed down or running smaller shifts because of the virus actually hitting the workforce there. So we have capacity sitting out there. We're not utilizing it. And so what that does is that constrains the supplies to the consumer, and those drive those prices up. But it also reduces the demand of the plant from the raw material producer, the cattle producer, the dairy producer, the meat, the natural fiber producer, and that drives those prices down. They can't move those products. So what we have is a choke point in the supply chain right in the middle. It's a bottleneck, and so that's what's keeping those ag prices down. Now, specifically, as we talked about, the cattle prices are down, and they dropped about another $10 a hundredweight in the last week. Milk prices are dramatically down. We talked last week that they had leveled off. National average all milk price was about $16 a hundredweight last week. Now they're down to about $14 per hundredweight. They lost $2, or roughly about 7 or 8% off of their price in just 1 week. So what's happening here is, well, we've done a couple of things. There's a couple of things that are happening. Some of the plants are having problems because they've closed down. And we've also seen the manufacturing plants that, butter, cheese, milk powders, things of that nature, ice cream. Those things aren't doing as much business. They're doing it at the retail level. They can still move in the retail levels. But because we're no longer in restaurants for meals, those were a lot of things, particularly cheese, are a lot of things that just aren't moving. The consumption is just not there. And we saw 20 plants in California last week start dumping milk for that very reason. The cheese demand is way off. And so we've changed where we eat. That's a very important thing for food. And if we looked at, prior to this, food away from home accounted for about 54% of food expenditures in the US, and then food at home was the remainder. Now, the estimates were that I saw earlier this week is that food at home now accounts for 80% of food expenditures. And so very few of them are at restaurants, some takeout and stuff, that's kind of holding up to a certain extent. But when we look at the difference between what we pay at home and what we pay in a restaurant, not only have we shifted more to at home, but that's at a lower cost to the consumer, because you go to the grocery store, you buy your food, you prepare it yourself, as opposed to going into a restaurant and paying much higher prices because they've got overhead, they've got labor and things like that. So it costs you a lot less to prepare that at home. So our total food expenditures are way down right now. So we're shifting where we see those things, and with the shift of where we eat, we get a little bit of a shift in what we're eating too, and how much we're eating, and that affects things like dairy, meats, and things of that nature. Okay, again, we talked about the milk prices being off by $2 a hundredweight. That really puts our dairy producers. I mean, unless something happens very quickly. I mean, they have their margin payments, but even at that they are going to need some very, very big help in terms of disaster relief. Malika talked about our congressional delegation, who was not involved in the ag committees, but taking a role in that thing in Congress, trying to get some of those things through. Thank you, Senator Cortez Masto. We appreciate that very much, and I hope the rest of our congressional delegation jumps in with her. So we need stuff like that. We need it for dairy. We need it for beef animals, and we're going to need it for sheep. Tom talked about the lamb prices being off in the east. Particularly right now, as we look at this is Passover week, and lamb consumption by the Jewish community goes up. That is a huge impact on demand, and if they can't get to the stores and are doing it, that's a big impact on that. The other half of that for sheep is not just the meat, but it's the wool. Last week we had talked about that the wool prices internationally had been down, looking at the Australian prices as the indicator, which they are, and they had leveled off last week. That had happened because China had jumped back in and did some buying. China has now bailed out completely, and wool prices dropped by more than a $1.50 per kilogram. About 60 or 70 cents a pound just in 1 week. They've fallen off. And even looking at the US prices for all grades of wool, they're off considerably from where they were just a couple of months ago. So across the board for the products that we produce in Nevada, the current situation is dismal, and unless we can start moving things forward, the outlook is dismal as well. As Malika said, hay is about the only thing that's holding up right now. Having said that, this is a time of year when hay prices are a little higher. Right now, if we look at California, they're just getting ready, some places, to go into their first cutting. So supplies will increase. Nevada's not there yet, particularly in the northern end of the state. Our first cuttings are a month or so away. So right now, we're working largely off last year's supplies. And so that helps hold those prices up. But once we start getting supplies in, the question is, will those supplies be enough to overwhelm the market and push prices down or not? We have to wait and see.
Thank you so much, Mike. I guess we'll open it up. You know, you mentioned the word dismal, and yet there is some relief. There is some assistance out there designed to kind of buoy the economy, small business owners, producers. let's talk about some of the assistance that's available for folks out there.
So we talked about this in last week's video, and there in the $2 trillion relief package, there are funds set aside for the ag community. So there's about $9.5 billion in an ag disaster fund, $14 billion that will fund the Commodity Credit Corp. And then it looks like, just doing some reading recently, it looks like ag producers with less than 500 employees will qualify for the small business, the SBA Paycheck Protection Program that opened up on Friday. A particular concern or unknown to ag producers, though, is how those H-2A, how those migrant worker on the payroll will, like, whether that will or won't qualify. So this fund, and this is not my area of specialty, but this particular set aside, and I think this is about 500 billion set aside to help small businesses. There is loan forgiveness tied to retaining employees on the payroll while they're laid off during COVID. So that I would encourage ag producers to keep their ear on the ground. I think there has been a little bit of a few roadblocks as this rolls out, you know, since it rolled out so fast, but definitely stay in touch with the FSA, the Rural Development, the SBA office. As Mike mentioned, our representatives in Congress, Cortez Masto in particular, and again, thank you, Cortez Masto, for advocating for agriculture producers, particularly livestock producers. They've been approaching the USDA, a bipartisan group from Congress has been talking to the USDA about setting aside specifically for livestock producers. And all of this information and more, Cooperative Extension is currently, our UNR Cooperative Extension is currently developing a web page to provide links about specific information and programs for Nevada producers. And I believe that's set to go live a week from today on the 15th.
And I hope they'll include this discussion in it too.
Yes.
We'll work on that. The thing I think also, Robert, need to be aware, sorry. Some of this stuff also has, even though it doesn't seem like it's agriculture, they have a lot of money for internet expansion and also for telemedicine. To be in agriculture in this century and next, we need to have infrastructure, especially in broadband, so people can be on 5G, because that's what things are going toward, and that would help in marketing products in our rural areas, as well as who knows what the broadband will bring in the future.
Great. Any last thoughts before we say goodbye for today? We're good?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Bob.
Thanks very much. We'll touch bases again next week then too.
Okay. All right.